want to see more? Support us at patreon.com/ReminerBand. Links in the description below. I was backpacking in Arkansas, the Eagle Rock Loop in the Washita National Forest. There's a section of the trail that goes through an area called the Albert Pike Recreation Area. In June of 2010, a flash flood killed 20 people, including men, women, and children. There's a ton of stories online about this event if you want to look it up. So I start my trip at Little Missouri Falls, going counterclockwise. It's 26 miles with some pretty good climbs. You can find a map of the loop on Google Images. So I hiked a fairly long day. If you Google Eagle Rock Loop map, you will find a basic sketch map, not the topo map, just one of the basic ones with the labels of the trails, mountains, and water crossings on Pinterest. At the bottom of the map there is a single water drop with a yellow circle around it. This just means it's always a wet crossing. There are several yellow circled water drops. The single one at the very bottom right next to the Viles Branch Trail. That is exactly where I was camped, so anyone can go there if you want to look it up and see what I'm talking about. So, that is the Little Missouri River. The water is flowing away from Albert Pike. I'm maybe 4 to 5 miles downstream from where the flash flood occurred. I don't know if this is significant or not to my story, but I'm not ruling it out either. I set up camp at about 4 p.m. for the day. This was November of last year. Fairly cold nights. It was about 26 degrees the night before. I was expecting another cold night in the high 20s. Not a lot of movement around there that night when it was cold. Most animals hunker down. I use a tarp where both ends are open. I have an inflatable sleeping pad and my 35-degree sleeping bag. Now, I'm set up on completely level ground. On my pad, on the tarp inside my sleeping bag, I quickly fall asleep around 10 p.m. after sitting around the fire. Everything is normal all evening, and all night for the most part. Now, you know when you're asleep and you fall in your dream? You get that sensation like you're falling in real life when you tense up and always wake up on impact. Okay. Well, I was asleep and I get the sensation sort of where I feel like I'm being dragged out of my tarp by my feet. Except it wasn't by my feet, I was being pulled by my sleeping bag. Like my whole pad with me in it suddenly being dragged out quickly. I woke suddenly as it startled me. Keep in mind, it was really cold, low 30s to high 20s at this point, and I have a 35-degree sleeping bag, so I'm inside my bag all the way with the top closed off by a shock cord. I'm completely inside my bag, covered to stay warm. Now, I'm wide awake and listening for any movement. Everything is still and quiet, except for the river next to me, obviously. That is the only sound I can hear. I didn't peek out my head. I just laid there awake and listening. I sat there for a good 15 minutes listening for any sound outside of the river. I never heard anything. Granted, the river is pretty loud being right there, but there was no movement around my camp at all. So I chalked it up to having that falling sensation when you dream. I figured I must have been dreaming about something and it made me feel like that I fell or something. I went to sleep for 30 or 45 minutes longer, still keeping my ears open but figuring I was probably just dreaming. So for the most part, I just shrugged it off and put my mind off of it and got back to sleep. Morning comes and I get up and put my shoes on and roll out of bed. I head straight over to the fire to pit it and stoke at the fire for first thing because it's definitely cold outside at 6:30 a.m. this morning. I turn back towards my tarp and head over to get my food hanging close by. That's when I noticed it, and I froze. My pad and sleeping bag at the foot end are sticking out from under my tarp, by a good 1.5 feet at least. I can think about how now, as I felt being dragged out from under my tarp the night before, staring at how my bed is from under the tarp. I slowly approach the tarp and look for any sort of footprints. The problem is I don't even see my own because the ground is so compact around there. I double check and I'm not in any sort of slope at all. The ground is completely flat. I really have no idea how this happened, and I know I was startled awake by that sensation of swiftly sliding down the hill towards my feet. My pad with me in it was being dragged out. I quickly had breakfast, packed up and headed out. I was supposed to spend one more night on the trail, but the longer I hiked the more I thought that what would happen the next night. These thoughts running in my head the entire day as I walked. Could it have been another person? I didn't hear anything. Why would anyone do that to anyone else? How could I have slid down so far? Maybe it was an animal. It couldn't have been. There were no punctures in my mattress and there were no footprints anywhere. Did I just slide throughout the night with restless sleep? It doesn't make any sense. I normally sleep on a slight incline, and I've never slid outside of the tarp before. Was this paranormal? I'm not far from Albert Pike. Could this have been some sort of ghost trying to save me from a flash flood horror that it was reliving over and over? All day long, the same things were running through my head. I ended up hiking to my car and sleeping in there that night. The Athens Big Fort Trail was very tough going up over 6 mountains. It was almost dark after I descended the last one. I hiked the last 3 or so miles by headlamp in the dark. I wasn't keen on sleeping on the trail another night after that. Truth is, I've been on that trail a ton and will for sure go back. I've been all over Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, New Mexico, and Colorado. Around 750 miles and countless nights spent in the woods all over the place. I almost exclusively hike solo. I never carry a gun or bear spray. I don't carry a SAT phone or GPS transponder. That is the only weird and unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me regarding camping, backpacking, and the outdoors. I had a very strange experience 12 years ago in Starved Rock State Park, Illinois. It was so bizarre at the time that I never discussed it. I began reading the missing 411 stories a few weeks ago and realized that I encountered something that fits into the missing 411 profile. Additionally, since many of the missing 411 stories border on the unexplainable and bizarre, I feel what I encountered was not unique, that it was part of an actual phenomena. So here's my story. I was visiting my girlfriend in Chicago on a sunny and warm winter day, and we decided to go for a hike at Starved Rock State Park in Illinois. I am an avid hiker, and being on leave from Iraq, I wanted to take in some cool fresh air. We hiked the park for several hours. In late afternoon, we started heading back to the car. About a half a mile away from the park, we came into an area where tree branches were broken and pulled towards over the trail. Most of the branches were broken high up, I'd say 8 feet or more off the ground. I lived in Washington before going to Iraq and knew something of Sasquatch areas, so I told my girlfriend that it looked like a Sasquatch area due to the branches being broken up so high up and pulled over the trail. That's about the time things started to get strange. Soon after mentioning this, I felt like someone was staring at me. It's like if you go to a room with a lot of people and someone is focused on you, and you get that uneasy feeling you can tell you're being watched. It was like this but stronger. I started to look around to see who was watching me. It was winter and the forest was visible for hundreds of feet in all directions. There was a group of walkers several hundred feet behind us, and no one in front of us, but I saw no one staring at me. As we passed through the squatch area, I began to have the feeling that someone was behind me, following us. I looked around and listened but saw and heard nothing. There were just people, 400 or so back on the trail behind us, and they were talking amongst themselves. They weren't looking our way. The sense of someone being behind me was persistent, so I kept looking behind me, and I'd say at least twice a minute, but there was just the group, way back there. The feeling of being watched is one thing, but feeling like someone is close behind you is something else. It's more disturbing. I told my girlfriend to go further in front of me and let her go about 20 feet in front of me because I had a strong sensation of a nearby presence just behind us. So I turned around not more than 30 seconds since the last time I looked back, and there's this woman there. She was walking but coming up on me fast. There was something way off about her speed. She was walking when I spotted her, but her speed was much faster than her gait. It was as if she was on a people mover escalator in an airport. She was coming up on me fast, but I couldn't say more than 15 or 20 feet behind me when I saw her. I was rather alarmed and glared at her. She stopped when our eyes met. I gave her a "what the fuck are you doing coming up on me like that" kind of glare. She stopped and stood there, and we stared at each other for a second. Neither of us moved. She had her head cocked back to her left and looked at me from the corner of her eyes in a slightly alarmed "you caught me" type of look. She was completely normal looking, like a Chicago lady in the late 50s, wearing a bright red winter coat, gloves, slacks, etc. In hindsight, there are a few other things besides her speed which stand out. The first thing is there was no sound, and no footsteps, and no rustling in the woods, and nothing to tell me to turn around other than the strong sensation of something behind me, which I had for a while. At the speed she was moving, she would have had to been running, but I heard no footsteps. She was not breathing hard and her mouth was closed, and her gait was a walking gait. She was not running. However, she was just so fast. When she stopped, I'd say she was less than 20 feet from me. At the speed she was moving, in 1 or 2 seconds she would have been to me. The next thing that stands out is her features. She had no distinguishing features. None in her hair, skin, or clothing. No shadowing or skin hues, dimples, etc. As a former Army criminal investigator, I know how to look for distinctive markings on people and clothing, and there just were none. I'd estimate her height at about 5'10". Her clothes were of uniform color and indistinct. It was like she just stepped out of a department store. Her bright red coat was pristine with a uniform hue to it. There was even shading, which there should have been given to the clear sky and low sun. After staring at each other for I'd say about 5 to 10 seconds, I felt like I got my point across, so I turned around and continued walking. My girlfriend had not noticed anything and continued walking herself. I took about 3 steps and realized there was no way she could have come up from that group in 30 seconds or so. I just looked back and there was no way. I spun around again and she was gone. She simply vanished. I checked the group behind us and no one had a red coat on or was looking at us. There was no one else around there and there were no sounds other than my footfalls. The woman just vanished. From that point, it took us about 10 minutes to reach the car. For the remainder of the walk, I did not feel like I was being stared at or followed. I have never been back to Starved Rock State Park, and have no intention of going back. The whole thing was bizarre. How was I supposed to tell anyone about that? So I never have. My mental state was fine. I have an IQ and a 20-year career in STEM field following Army service. At the time, I was doing work at a DOD in Iraq. I was well rested and relaxed being on vacation with the girlfriend. There were no drugs or alcohol involved. These were strictly prohibited in my line of work and were grounds for immediate termination under MNFI's GO1, which I was subject to at the time. I've carried this experience for around 12 years, being unable to talk about it because it was an exceptional and an unexplainable story. Upstate, a 4-year-old boy disappeared. He was last seen about 2 hours before he was reported missing. He wandered or was abducted from his campsite, and we had about 20 people looking for him at first. But later that went up to about 80, which is when I joined. We had no new leads, but we did know that there was a river nearby, so we decided to check that. We had a few people in rafts going down the river to see if we could find anything. He was last seen in a pair of blue sweatpants, a Lightning McQueen t-shirt, a Mater beanie from the movie Cars, and a pair of white Adidas. I went off and decided to check near a road. This sits on a shelf. Above it is a mountain blocking a huge expanse of 4,000 acres of wilderness. Below it is a steep rocky slope that leads into a small area that has been known for bears and mountain lions. So I decided that I would check there and see if I could find any evidence of him. It's more than possible that he was attacked by an animal and dragged away, possibly to here. I went in and saw a bear den. It wasn't hibernating season, so I checked it out and didn't find anything. I looked into the trees and I could see if I could find mountain lions had somehow pulled them up there, but still found nothing. I looked up the rock slope and there was a brown lumpy mess of blood, fur, and skin. I cautiously walked up to it to find a deer carcass. It looked fairly fresh and there were no scratches on it. It had been gutted and everything, just the skin was left in a mushy mess. Freaked out, I walked down the slope and called in what I had found. I decided to walk around a little bit in the wooded area to see if I could find anything else. If I didn't, I would go back to the main area. There was nothing, so I went to the main area and asked about any new leads. Somebody claimed to have seen him for about an hour after he was reported missing, on the other side of the campsite. We all went over there and spread out in a fan and began scouring every inch of land for the kid. We found nothing, so later we called in helicopters. At this point we had 200 volunteers. Everywhere within a 50-mile radius had been searched and there was nothing. It was almost like he wasn't even here. Even scent dogs couldn't pick up his trace anywhere. About 8 months later, a friend of mine in search of rescue says that they found the kid. They were found by a group of skiers just behind the mountain. They found the boy underneath a mass of rocks, and that had to be about 300 pounds. They had to get a team out there and they rolled the rock off to bring him home for an autopsy. The coroner said that the kid had died from a brain aneurysm maybe 2 days before being found. There was no cliff or mountain super close nearby, so there's no way the rock fell onto him, and there's no way this kid could live through hot summers, then cold winters, and end up under a huge rock. This story bothers me. I have no idea how this could have happened. I guess he could have been kidnapped and kept for 8 months and then be dumped in the woods and have a large rock thrown on top of him. But how would he get a brain aneurysm, and how would the rock end up on him? It took 4 grown men to roll this rock off him. It bothers me knowing that a mere few miles from where I found that deer carcass, this boy would be found. I recently remembered something very strange that happened to me in Lincoln National Forest, in south central New Mexico, when I was 6 or 7 years old. My grandparents owned a trailer near Sacramento, New Mexico, in the Lincoln National Forest in the mid-90s, and my mother, 2 siblings, and I visited on a weekend sometime during that era. I had 2 teenage male cousins that were also visiting the same weekend. While there, my cousins offered to take my mother, siblings, and I on a hike. We left shortly after sunrise after our first morning trip. The first couple of hours of the hike were pretty normal, nothing worth noting. However, as the day wore on, I remember my mother became worried that we were getting lost. She expressed her concern to my 2 cousins who were leading us. I remember them assuring us that they knew where we were and we continued on. They wanted to take a different route to return because they wanted to show us a river, which is a rare thing for folks from southern New Mexico. But as we kept going, there was no river in sight, and my mother became convinced that we were lost. My cousins assured us once again that we were not lost and told us that there was a road a short distance away, and that we could wait there while our grandparents' trailer got there to give us a ride back home. Once we reached the road, my cousins and my family split up. We literally waited for hours without a single sign of my cousins, or any other sign of human life for that matter. None of us were carrying a watch. This was obviously before cell phones were stranded. Eventually, a red SUV-type vehicle, I don't recall the make or model, came around the mountain. We were partially relieved but also somewhat apprehensive because we didn't recognize the vehicle. The vehicle slowed down when it came closer to us without having to flag it down. We didn't recognize the driver, but he rolled down the window and asked us if everything was okay. When my mother walked up closer to the window to speak to him, she noticed a middle-aged woman in the front seat who she didn't recognize. To her surprise, my 2 cousins were in the back seats. My mom ignored the man's questions and immediately started asking my 2 cousins where they had been. She told them we were hungry and tired and wanted to get back to my grandparents. Amidst her concern, they both ignored my mom. They both just stared blankly ahead and remained silent. Initially, my mom thought they were joking, but the more she tried to get a word out of them, the more the situation became awkward. They remained completely silent and expressionless, staring straight ahead throughout the entire conversation. At this point, I remember my mother becoming visibly alarmed. The man and woman then asked if we needed help again. They were both extremely friendly and never stopped smiling. My mother, visibly shaken, declined their offer for help and motioned us to all return to the side of the road. As we walked away, the man said, "Be careful, it's easy to disappear out here," and sped off. Literally moments later, we noticed my grandpa's van turn around the corner the opposite direction as the red SUV. Needless to say, we were immensely relieved. My grandpa stopped the vehicle right next to us and we walked around to get in. When the door opened, we noticed my two cousins were in the back seat. My mom then started shouting a mixture of anger and amusement, exclaiming what a mean prank that was. My siblings and I joined in. However, my cousins then said that they had no idea what we were talking about. They said they had spent all day walking to the trailer, and as soon as they got there, they hopped in the van with my grandpa and came to pick us up. My grandpa and cousins looked shocked at our accusations, and it eventually turned into a very serious discussion with everyone, recalling their exact actions along with the timeline of events. Even after all these years, my cousins swear they're telling the truth. In July of this year, 2016, I was on a personal retreat at a yoga center in Colorado. I too live in Colorado. I'm a fairly experienced hiker and have been to this facility several times over the years, so I had been on solo hikes on this land with some familiarity with the trails. The second day of my retreat, I set out in the afternoon on a solo hike. I took my cell phone for taking photos. About 3/4 of a mile into the hike on a well-marked trail, I walked maybe 5 feet off trail to have a look at a brightly colored sign attached to a tree which gave the name of the national forest I was in. I read the sign and turned around to go back on the trail, and literally the trail was not there. I found myself in a different location. How could this be possible? I thought to myself, and then of course, one begins to panic when things go wonky. I calmed myself down and circled the area trying to find the trail, or some way to get back on track. But it was just not there. I made sure to not wander from the small area that I was in, yet I was still searching for a way out. I retraced my steps to I've only told 2 people this. Now I'm telling everybody. I have no choice because it's consuming me. My brother believed me and he was sure it was someone physically messing with me. My son believed me when after 800 hours of research I came up with an invisible Bigfoot theory. Now he too is scared of the forest. Personally, I'm leaning towards demons, aliens, or cloaked military forces. It was another beautiful day. I had the day off and had just moved into a new home in an area that I had grown up in. It was nice to be back in the old neighborhood. Close to great hiking trails, creeks, and waterfalls, I took off down the old Indian trail I knew like the back of my hand. As children, all the neighborhood kids played in the creek and forest. As teenagers, we spent every summer day there and nights. When my children were young, I had them there every weekend. As teenagers, they as well hung out there with their neighborhood friends. When I reached the end of the steep trail which stops at the creek, I sit on the rocks, lay back, and take a break to stare back at the sky. It was a beautiful, perfect blue and yellow day. Not one cloud in the sky and the sun shining proudly on the world. I thought about what was sitting there and just relaxing and contemplating my life. I was thinking about what a beautiful, perfect place we live in. We have it all. I stood up to walk along the creek to reach the waterfall at the end. I took a few steps and stopped. I just stood there frozen, looking in front of me. There was nothing. I stood there, still. I couldn't go any further. I could just sense something. There was this overwhelming thought coming into my head. Loud and clear, it said, "You're not perfect. Humans will always have fear. Fear will destroy you." Something made me run. I was overcome with fear like I have never felt in my life. Something was there that I couldn't see it chasing me. I ran back the way that I came at top speed. Panic speed, run for your life speed. Yes, it was chasing me. I heard footsteps behind me. Not like normal steps, but exactly like little rocks or stones lightly landing on the forest floor without rolling or rustling the leaves. As I'm running back up the trail, I glance back and I see nothing. Still running in a panic, I start to think this is ridiculous. I don't scare easy. I stop on the trail, turn around, and stand looking. With a split second, I can still hear the steps following me, yet I can't see anything unusual. I run and reach the top. I'm 5 minutes from home. I run home and I call my brother. Of course my brother believed me. He could hear the fear in my voice. He was quite sensible about the whole thing. He suggested that it was teenagers fooling around like we used to do all those years ago, or he suggested that it might be a creepy man who was watching me. I agree with him, but I knew different. I must be losing my mind. I go see my priest and I can't tell him. I tell him I'm stressed and not sleeping well. I tried a little to veer the conversation towards souls and spirits, but he resisted. I left. Convinced there is something wrong with me, I go to see my doctor. I couldn't tell him the real story. What if he said I was schizophrenic? I had a full physical. Now I can't sleep and my perfect content life seems rattled by something I have no idea what it could be. I lose my job and new house. I don't want to walk anymore, and I used to walk 2 hours a day. My friends and family don't call anymore. A year later in my new home, I start to search for answers on the internet. I'm not the only one that has experienced things like this I've seen. So anytime me and my friend Ryan and I had a break from school, we would head straight for the woods. We decided to camp about midway through Jack's River Trail in the Cahuta Wilderness. It's a trail we knew fairly well, as we used to go use this before to practice long hikes when we were in school. We moved deeper into the trail and started to look at a place to make camp. We always camped a pretty decent ways off the trail and in areas that weren't popular with overnight camping. Around 9, we were settled comfortably around the fire. We were no strangers to the sounds in the woods, and these woods were full of animals, from deers to black bears and even the random wild boar. With an animal walking on all fours, you hear a tighter group of steps, but what we were hearing sounded very distinct to what a human sounds like when slowly walking or trying to move without making much of a sound. Whenever we would fix our lights on a spot we thought the sound was coming from, the location of the sound would suddenly change. It was as if there were multiple people walking around us. That's when the whistling started. 2 consecutive notes with roughly a 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. Ryan finally yelled out into the darkness, "Hey!" Quiet. The whistling stopped. The crunching of the wood stopped, and then there was nothing. We sat there in silence for a few minutes when the woods erupted with noise. Something or someone was running in circles around our campsite, and the whistling came back. 2 consecutive notes with the same 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. How could someone whistle this loudly without cracking, while also running? The movement stopped, but the whistling was still constant. It was so loud and inhuman. I heard some movement directly in front of me. I swept my light up in front of me, and for maybe 2 seconds, I saw it. Whatever this person or thing was, it was about 5 feet up in a tree. Everything about it was long. Its arms, legs, necks, fingers, just everything. And it was fast. As soon as the light hit it, it launched backwards off the tree. I heard it hit the land, but I never saw it go anywhere else. Maybe 10 minutes later, we saw a couple of flashlight beams coming through the woods, and about 3 guys came into view asking if everything was okay. One of the guys walked around a bit and came back and said he didn't see anything. We didn't get any sleep that night and left first thing in the morning. During my childhood, I grew up northwest of New York City, in an area near the Delaware River. I lived next door to my best friend, let's call him Jack. Being the same age, we spent every day of the summer hanging out and exploring the woods, mountains, rivers, and lakes around our homes. We'd take off in the morning on our bikes and come home around dinner time. We would spend pretty much every day in the woods exploring, hiking, biking, fishing, and climbing. We had been doing this for years and we were pretty familiar with our surroundings. One day, we rode our bikes on some trails that we had been on countless times before. We decided to take a break in an area that we had never stopped at before. The resting spot was flanked by a ridge covered with heavy brush to our left and a steep embankment to our right. We had never ventured over the ridge before, so we decided we'd climb it and see what was on the other side. The ridge itself wasn't all that tall, probably about 150 feet. However, it was covered in heavy brush that made it a bit more difficult to climb. When we made it to the top, we continued our way forward until we came up upon a lake. It wasn't a terribly large lake. You could easily see the other side and could swim in it without much of an issue. We walked around the lake, but we came back into a dock. This seemed pretty strange and out of place. However, we assumed we stumbled upon someone's land. We were young teenagers and weren't hurting anything, so we found it cool and we hung out for a bit on the dock. After about 10 minutes of shooting the shit and joking around, we decided to explore the area a bit more, and found a small metal rowboat tucked in a small brush. Excited by our luck, we decided to take the rowboat on the lake for a bit. Once we got into the water, we rowed about 20 feet into the lake, and that's when things started to feel very strange. I got a very uncomfortable feeling, a very visceral fear that something seemed unprovoked by anything external. It can only be described as a common feeling of being watched, but by someone with evil, sinister intentions. At the exact moment when I was hit by fear, I looked to Jack and saw the same uncomfortable, fearful look in his eyes. We had spent countless days and hours in these woods. We had come across bears, coyotes, and never once since before have I had this feeling, or seen that look in Jack's eyes. Without saying a word, we started a rowboat back towards the dock. I felt incredibly anxious and just wanted to be off the boat immediately, and gone from that area and on my way back home. Once we reached the dock, it felt like an eternity. We jumped off the boat and began quickly pulling it out of the water. Just as we were doing this, we heard a very loud bang hit a metal trash can right behind us. We looked at each other completely frozen and terrified and ripped the boat out of the water. We ran the boat back to where we found it, dropped it off, and took off sprinting in the direction we came over the ridge. We practically fell our way down the ridge, getting caught up in the brush, bumps, and bruised all over. We found our bikes and took our way back down trail. To this day, Jack and I still remember that moment of terror. There is no reasonable explanation for why we were both overcome by such fear at that exact moment in time. We didn't see or hear anyone around us that day, and we never ventured back to that lake to investigate again. This happened in late November of 2014 in northern Minnesota. The nearest town would be Cook. I will start with a little bit of backstory. We own 160 acres that butts up to the Net Lake Indian Reservation. It's a very desolate place. If you were to get lost and walked north or west, you wouldn't hit a road for at least 50 miles. Anyways, our firearms deer season starts the first week in November. My father had his stand fairly close to the northern property line. There had been a fresh 4 inches of snow the night before. From his stand about 200 yards away, he noticed where something had crossed his shooting lane. After sitting for a few hours and not seeing anything, he decided to take a walk and see what had crossed. What he found were 16-inch long human-like footprints. Me and Tim have had many other experiences, so we knew it was from a Sasquatch. Anyway, on to the story. It was a Wednesday around 3 p.m. Beaver trapping season had just opened the weekend prior, and I was ready to set some traps. I took my four-wheeler to a large pond on our property and was going to set 330 conibears. It was a very strange day. Most of the snow from earlier in the month had melted and the woods were wet. The first thing I noticed when I shut the four-wheeler off is that there was no sound in the forest at all. No birds, no squirrels, and nothing at all. There was no wind at all either, and the clouds were clearly touching the treetops. So, I walked about 150 yards off the trail to the pond. I was halfway through setting a trap when I heard 3 consecutive wood knocks. I knew that it was immediately upholstered by my black powder, .44, and shot across the pond hoping to scare it away. After about 10 minutes of standing still and listening without hearing anything, I finished setting the trap. As I bent down to set the second one, I had heard another 3 wood knocks, this time much closer. I dropped my trap and started running back to the four-wheeler. I was not looking where I was going, and I was looking in the direction it came from. I made up that 150 yards in no time, jumping logs and such without thinking about it. I got the four-wheeler started and looked up and saw a large hairy creature walking away, and he glanced back at me. He had at least 8 feet tall and had cinnamon-colored coat and human facial features. I got out of there as fast as I could. The next day I went back to check my trap and grabbed the one I had left unset. I had a large beaver and was pretty excited until I found my other trap, about 12 feet in the air in a tree. I still hunt as often as I can, but I haven't trapped at that pond since. This is a story from a road trip my fiancé and I took back in 2010. Our trip had been relatively benign and uneventful, with a few exceptions. One was those of a road trip through Colorado. We were on our way to Rocky Mountain National Park, but it was getting dark and we needed to stop for a night. A quick look at the road atlas showed us that we were close to a few campgrounds. After a short discussion, we decided to try and find a few of them. The paved road turned into an unpaved washboard-like trail. The trees around us turned from pine to birch, and the forest just felt wrong somehow. But we continued onwards nonetheless, determined to find the damn campground. After about an hour of driving, slowly, we didn't shake the car to pieces, we came across one of the camps. The campground was like something from the beginning of a mystery thriller. Everything was overgrown and the fire pits were growing weeds. The signs were all rusted or shot up, and the moon didn't quite penetrate the trees. We decided this was not the place for us and continued onward. Another hour of driving passed. It was pitch black, and the road amazingly got tough in spots for our tiny little Avio. We resigned ourselves to another night sleeping at a rest stop, and began to try to find a way out. Suddenly, we saw bright headlights on the road ahead. We continued forward and found ourselves in a large clearing, headlights from us being turned on, blinding us without seeing the road. 3 men with various expressions of anger and fear appeared out of the gloom and approached the car. In the bright lights of the 2 trucks, I could now see a burned-out trailer, and all the men were wearing black clothing. The look of malice on the men approaching my side of my vehicle burned its way into my brain, and I instantly felt terrified. I yelled at my fiancé to floor it, and he was desperately trying to find the exit. We finally saw the trail marking reflectors across the clearing and gunned it out of there, with the men jumping out of the way in surprise. The final half hour before we finally found ourselves back in civilization was spent in creeped out silence. We stuck to sleeping in rest stops in national parks after that.